Great. So welcome to the lecture series today. This lecture series is a part of a longer thought process that has gone into thinking about climate change, rights of rivers, and South Asia, specifically in India. This lecture series is hosted by a project called Riverine Rights at Oslo Metropolitan University in Oslo, in Norway. I'm Rahul Ranjan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here for this Riverine Rights project. In this project, we have 3 different countries, including Colombia, New Zealand, and India. And I work on Indian case study of legal personhood to understand the nature of law in relation to some of the more key themes of emotion, grief, climate change, and religious ecology. I'm very happy that Archana has accepted my request on a very short notice and decided to come in and give a talk today. But before I introduce her, I'd like everyone to know that this program is part of a longer series consisting of 11 lecture on different component of environmental history and politics in India. And the series concludes with a book launch or a discussion on a book by Camelia Diwan on 29th of October. Most of the information about the series has already been put on Twitter as forms of thread, which would lead you to register. So just in case if someone who's not on Twitter and are interested in this, you should write to me and I will send the due links for further information. I'm very happy to introduce today our speaker, Archana Sorang. Archana, in her introduction, says she belongs to Khadia tribe. She's one of the members of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisor Group on Climate Change, which was launched on 27th of July 2020. Archana is also an experienced researcher and a youth climate in advocacy and research on rights of indigenous community and climate change. She's working to document, preserve, and promote traditional knowledge and cultural practices among indigenous community. She holds a master's degree in regulatory governance from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So this is her formal background, but I draw a lot of inspiration, and I'm sure several who are here and outside know Archana for absolutely fantastic work she's doing, which is so much required today in the wake of this emergent crisis of climate change, but also broadly thinking about some of the long-lasting effects that either written off from the text of, the solution-based climate change discourse. So Archana, very welcome to the series. And if you would like to use slide, and I can share, I can make you a co-host, you can share the screen. If you're not using it, just continue to go on. At any point, if you feel that you need any help and assistance, I'm here. And you have about 40 minutes to speak, and then we would open the floor for questions for people to ask. There are 2 ways in which people can ask questions. One is to write it into the chat box, and I will have it read at the end of her talk. And the second way is to just use reaction emojis and raise your hand, and I'll have you unmuted and you can ask your question yourself. And thanks everyone for coming to the talk today. Archana.
Thank you so much, Rahul, for this opportunity. It's indeed a very great opportunity to come and interact here and share my experience and thoughts. So once again, thank you so much. And I feel this is indeed a very important platform. And as you rightly said, that it's a series of interaction which even I came across in Twitter, with a varied range of people coming and sharing their thoughts and experience, which itself shows that how climate issues or environmental issues is in it is so much in terms of intersectionality, and it is so much in terms of diversity and varied perspective, which is important. So yeah, talking about my perspective and my intervention today. So I would like to start. So I'll be mostly speaking, and please feel free to raise your hand and put your thoughts, anything in the comments, and we can interact. And definitely we'll be interacting after my sharing also. So yeah, so from my end, I would like to emphasize on how indigenous communities are the frontliners of climate action and biodiversity conservation, yet they are the ones who are most affected by the impacts of climate crisis. So talking about climate justice and climate action, I would like to start about speaking about how indigenous communities are have a strong relationship with nature and climate. So I would like to start about talking about myself. So my name is Archana Soren. The meaning of my surname in my tribal language, which I belong to Kharia tribe, means rock. So the surname means rock, and there are similar surnames in a tribal communities. Like I belong to Kharia tribe, and there are surnames like Kullu, which is tortoise. There is surname like Kiro, which means tiger. There is surname called Kerketa, which is kind of a bird. There is surname called Dung Dung, which is a kind of a fish. So the reason of telling this is that when we say that as an indigenous communities, nature is a source of identity and we have element of nature embedded in our name itself, it itself shows the huge relationship which we have with nature, that we have uh, the elements of nature embedded in our name itself. And it's not only amongst the indigenous communities in India, but it is also in terms of indigenous communities in the Latin America and across the globe, which they have so interrelationship with the nature. They also have the elements of nature in the name itself. And then talking about my journey about how I got into climate action. So one of the thing which I have strongly realized is that for us indigenous people, like biodiversity conservation or climate action, this term is something which is which has come up so recently, but these terms never existed for us in a way that we practiced this term. Even if these terminologies did not exist from years ago, wherein if I say, then these are our actions and practices which we have been undertaking since years and since our ancestors taking it. Like, for example, I would like to also emphasize about how my own grandfather has been pioneer of community-led forest protection practices. And he was of the opinion that how if we live in a sustainable relationship with forest, then we will be able to have a sustained way of life. And that is when there was a lot of timber mafias coming in our areas, and when there was a lot of deforestation happening in our areas in 1950s and 40s. And that is when my grandfather took the leadership in my village area, and they started community-led forest protection practices. And I feel that those values of how, the sustainability concept of how we have to take care of each other, like we, until and unless we take care of forest, we ourselves will not be safe. So that has been emerging since our ancestors. And this values today when I hear from my grandfathers and from my fathers, I feel it is so important, because we are talking about these concepts and we are talking about these narratives now, if we see the contemporary developmental era. But for us indigenous people, it has been there since a long time. And then coming to my father, I would like to say that my father has been a practitioner of indigenous healthcare medicines, and he was a specialist of snake bites. So while I was growing up, I have seen that my father giving medicines to the community members who were coming because of snake bites, and this medicines was given out of leaf and roots. And I have seen a multiple people, and a lot of people, those who coming, were getting cured of this. But then the thing is ki this indigenous healthcare practitioner is something which my father did not uh, have as a professional degree, but this was again the transition of knowledge which had come through an intergenerational knowledge to him from his uncles and from his fathers, which also makes me realize that how crucial it is for the intergenerational transition of indigenous knowledge, and which I have myself seen from my father's experience. But now when I lost my father in 2017, it also made me realize that once the person is not there, the knowledge gets lost. So it's very important for us to ensure that those transition of knowledge of indigenous healthcare practitioners or biodiversity conservation or climate action needs to be transitioned to the upcoming generation, which again I feel like, being an indigenous youth, I feel it's a huge important role for us indigenous to go back to our elders, because until and unless we do not go back to them and document them and understand the perspective, then we will lose out on a major chunk of indigenous knowledge, which is again in the form of songs, which is again in the forms of whether it is folk song, whether it is stories. And this is again a very oral history of indigenous people which we have. And that is also what made me reflect in terms of my journey of climate action. And I would just wrap up my journey part of climate action by saying that both of my parents have been, my mother and my father have been active in indigenous rights in my own area. I come from an area which is highly mining loaded area, wherein there has been an extractive developmental projects. And I also come from an area which is highly, which has a high population of indigenous communities and forest cover. Uh, so it's again a very dicey place, wherein there has been a lot of imposition of industrialization and there is a lot of imposition of developmental projects. But again, it is also the question of what is important for the indigenous people, whether the development which is being imposed is important for the indigenous people, or the way of living which they have always been practiced is important for indigenous people and it needs to be revived. And that is what both of my parents, when I was growing up, when I was in class 10, so they told me that it is very important to enter into the policy making if you want to have a constructive change in the society. And I think that stuck me a lot with me, and that has something which has guided me throughout my journey. And that is what I feel has kept me pushing forward and reaching out to youth groups and policy making spaces, because I feel for us indigenous people to reach to the policy making space is really, really crucial, because it's always been people who make policy for us and impose those policies on us. But it's not being that other way around, where we are there part of the policy making processes. And that is why I feel my journey of climate action is more, if I say, in terms of rights recognition of indigenous people, because rights recognition of indigenous people, if there is rights recognition, it is only when the indigenous people will feel secure. And when the indigenous people are feeling secure, they'll be able to contribute towards climate action. And the second thing which is very crucial is we have to take ahead with our traditional knowledge and practices for the climate action process. And that is what requires a lot of initiative from the indigenous youth, yes, but also requires from the other factors in terms of civil society organization and government entity as well, because we cannot deny that how developmental projects lead to erasing or eroding of the traditional knowledge and practices also. And the third thing which I would like to say, that it requires a meaningful leadership of indigenous youth and indigenous people in the climate action process. But again, it's until and unless you create enabling environment, they will not be able to be part of it. And that which requires that a conscious effort and a structural level effort is required to ensure that indigenous people are part of it. So yes, so this has been my journey. And then I'll be moving on to the section where I would be sharing few of my field insights of how indigenous people are contributing towards climate action and biodiversity conservation. And then I'll be moving into the challenges which they are facing. So first of all, I would like to start about the eco-friendly practices which we say, or the practices which the indigenous people have been adopting. So for me, for my communities, what I have seen from my very childhood, the moment we get up, so we used to brush our teeth from twigs of leaves, twigs of trees, whether it is a neem plant, whether it is sal plant. So these are those small branches or twigs which are used to brush the teeth. And this has been practiced since ages. And now if we see, these are alternative to plastic toothbrushes, or these are alternatives to plastic pollution, because now we are talking about the concepts of bamboo toothbrush, or now even we are also talking about this twigs of trees, which is also called datun. So if I say that these practices have always been there with the indigenous communities. And second thing which I would like to say, that I have seen in my own villages and in my houses, that how vegetables like pumpkin, vegetables like bottle gourd, because they have this diameter of circular diameter. So these vegetables are also used as water bottles. So how they are used as water bottles? So like the inside pulp of the vegetables are used for eating, and the outside crust of vegetables are dried. And this dried vegetables are also used to carry waters. So if we see that these have been used by the indigenous communities and my ancestors, and now if we see that it is an alternative to plastic pollution, which also says that because the outer crust is used for water bottles and the inner crust is used for vegetables, it also shows that how there has been no waste. So it's also again the way of living, that where there has been the concept of waste is not there as such, because everything you eat is either utilized by yourself or is being utilized by the animals like cow and goats. So it's again in that way. And if we also see that, if we see how we cook food, so it's also that all the utensils which were initially made was also made by the earthen pots or the earthen muds. So if we see in that way also, that how it has been a very sustainable way, if we see. And one of the very important way is about the leaf which we are using. And these leaf plates are also major source of forest-based livelihood. So now the thing is, these leaf plates are being sustainably plucked leaves are made as leaf plates and cutleries. So now there's also a way how this leaves are being plucked for the leaf plates. The indigenous communities go to the forest to pluck leaf for making leaf plates, but they have their own understanding and perspective that if they are going to this east part of the forest this year, then for the next year they'll be going to the west part of the forest. So that's why they also give time for the leaves to get rejuvenated. And that's also a sustainable way, that they are not using the leaf in a way that it gets exhausted. So that's also very important, that how the major source of forest-based livelihood of the leaf leaves are also an alternative to plastic. And similarly, they are making chairs, they are making mats, they are making tables. So all of these, if we see, their own way of living has been very sustainable. So this are some examples of how indigenous people have been living in a sustainable way. And apart from that, if we see the farming patterns also, and we see that how farming patterns have been an integral part of land sustainable use. So if we see that indigenous people have always been engaged into multiple cropping pattern, and also if we see the I always say this, and I have always reflected on this, that who were the ones who created fertilizers and pesticides? It was not indigenous people, because indigenous people, for us, it was always like we used cow dung manure. So it's also think that why pesticides and fertilizers were used and what it has led us to. Because I think it's very crucial that for indigenous people, it is also how they have been using natural way of cropping patterns, wherein there has been less where it has been organic. So I think it's very important to also see, when we talk about organic farming in today's era. So the organic farming, the term was not there, but the indigenous communities practiced it a way longer than it. So these are certain kind of ways which is practiced by the indigenous communities. And now about the practices, I would like to start with forest fire. So forest fire is one of the most prevalent uh, uh, one of the most prevalent climate crisis, or one of the major challenges which we see in the indigenous area. So the area from where I come from is also, we see that we witness forest fires. So specifically in during the summer season, the indigenous peoples have their own committees, the village level committees or the forest committees, wherein the indigenous people make the resolution that every day we will be going for forest patrolling, and specifically in terms of summer season, because when the summer season, when the leaves fall, and then when it is a dried leaves, there are a lot of chances of forest getting fire. So there are two things: either forest fires are you get forest fire either by natural ways, or also by other external ways where it is lit. So when it is lit by external ways, so indigenous people also, because they go for forest patrolling, they also make sure that the outsiders people do not lit fire in the forest. So that is also one way of forest patrolling, which happens because of their internal governance, and which happens because of the village level committees. And the second thing, it's like when they are going for patrolling, when there are a lot of dried leaves, they also make sure that they make lines. And in the terms, if we use in the scientific terms, so these are called forest lines, and these lines are created by the indigenous people, so that the forest is not spread. Now for the example, if there is a lot of dried leaves fallen, and if because of the hustle or because of any natural reason, if the forest is lit, and if the all the dried leaves are scattered, so entire forest will get burned. But if the forest line is there, and if the dried leaves are separated at certain intervals of areas, then the spread of fire will stop, because there is no leaf again, because it's only the sand or the soil. So these are some ways which the indigenous people continuously do, specifically in the summer season. So again, if you see how the governance structure, or how the constant relationship with the forest or constant monitoring of the forest make sure that they prevent forest fire. And apart from that, if we see about forest fire also, there have been a lot of times when indigenous people, whether it is night or whether it is morning, that there has been outbreak of forest fires. So even if when the government people or other people are not able to reach out, indigenous people are the first ones who, irrespective of whatever they are doing, just go there to douse the fire, which also shows that it is their responsibility, or it has been their responsibility and priority to ensure that they stop forest fire. The second thing which I would like to come across about few practices. So like one of the practices of forest conservation or rejuvenation, which I would like to cite one of the example of my field areas where I have been working. So I come from Odisha, and I come from a place, I have been working in a place called Nayagarh district of Odisha. And in Nayagarh district of Odisha, since 1970s and 1980s, there has been a lot of, there were a lot of deforestations happening. And because of lot of deforestation happening by timber mafias and other peoples, so because the forest and the hills were cut, it also led to lot of soil erosion, because the trees were cut, and when it was raining it led to soil erosion. And this soil erosion not had the sand deposits in the agriculture land of the indigenous people, which again, because of the destruction of forest by someone else, their livelihood was affected because of the soil erosion and soil deposits. So they were also struggling for water, drinking water, and they were also struggling for the livelihood. So if we see in that way, the indigenous people then again have come, like making committees like 10 villages coming together and forming committees, which is a governance system. Like, we 10 villages of this area will be protecting this area of the forest. We 3 villages coming together will be protecting this area of the forest. And that is how, whichever forest is nearby, the villagers are coming together to protect. Now the thing is ki over the period of time, there has been also instances where the indigenous people themselves are also contributing for the protection. Like, for example, every individuals cannot go to protect the forest or patrol the forest, so they keep people or assign people that these people will be going for patrolling. And slowly and gradually they had started with 1 rupees, that those who are going for patrolling, they'll give them 1 rupees, because that is also because they are also leaving the 1 day of work at home and they're going to forest patrol. So how financially also they were sustaining themselves and they were protecting those forests. So these were one way of they were giving money and also contributing to protection. The other way, if I say the example, is that how women have been in the forefront of forest protection. So there's a practice called Thenga Pali practices. Now the thing is, what is Thenga Pali practices? So if Thenga means stick, Pali means turn. So when the timber mafias were there and when there was a lot of destruction happening in that area, so indigenous people, especially the men, were the ones who were protecting it. But over the period of time, because it was men protecting the forest, they also saw that there is a lot of conflict and a tussle between the timber mafias and men, because it's like men and men fighting kind of situation. And at that point of time, in some areas of Nayagarh district, the men said that we request the help of women to come and help us in the forest protection. And then women were going for the forest protection. But the thing is was, again, after some point of time, that women felt that we are in the forefront, but we do not have the decision making powers. So they also felt that just because in order to resolve conflict, or just because in order to make sure that there is no conflict, we are being tokenized. And that is when women started asserting their rights. And women from then onwards said that if we are protecting the forest, we will also have the decision making process, or will also be involved in the decision making process of the forest protection. And since then, it's been 40 to 50 years, women have been protecting those areas in Nayagarh district through Thenga Pali practices. And in this Thenga Pali practices, every day 4 women get up early in the morning. They get up early in the morning, around 3 a.m., do all the household work, cleaning work, and then go for forest patrolling with the help of stick. And they do this forest patrolling and come back in the afternoon and keep those stick in front of the next house. So when they keep those stick in front of the next house, then it is implicit that the next house responsibility is to go and protect the forest. And so on, the stick rotates in the village. And in that way, entire village women are going for forest patrolling. But here again, the issue, if we see deep within, it looks, wow, women are contributing, or women are protecting the forest, getting up early in the morning and taking care of the forest as well. But if you see deep down within, it's a very problematic issue of overburdening of responsibility. And if you see, when we talk about overburdening of responsibility, it's again, if you ask the question, it's like, why are the women doing it so? Like, what does it take for them to get up in the 3 a.m. and do household work, taking care of the family and taking care of the forest? So the thing is, this overburdening of responsibility, if you ask them, it's for them is like, forest is like a children. The way we are taking care of our family, we are also taking care of the forest, because when we grow older, or when we grow older, it's the forest who will take care of us. And that's why we want to take care of the forest. And because forest is the children, or forest is the family. So if we see in this way, the elder women say that the forest is the children, the younger women say the forest is the mother. So they have that intrinsic relationship of how they have been a caring and sharing nature is there. But now the thing is, in this entire scenario, what should be done? The least which the community members are expecting in this entire scenario is to recognize their efforts, is to recognize their rights, because these community members are contributing so much every day. But there is no recognition, there is no acknowledgement of the work. And apart from that, if tomorrow they are being evicted on that place, then it's been like, removing them from their own home, which again, they have no security of the contribution which they have been done. So the least which the community members there are asking in and also the women, is to recognize their community rights, is to recognize the rights over the land and the forest, which itself brings down that there is an issue of overburdening of responsibility, yes, but it is also important that how this overburdening of responsibility needs to be taken care of, what efforts needs to be done by the government levels, what responsibility needs to be done by the village level. Also, women have been advocating there that, we want the men also to support us, and the men also have been supporting us, but the past incidents shows that how it was inefficient and how it led to conflict. So that fear is also there, that again they might lose out on the forest. And if we talk about the institutions and structures, they have their own mechanisms and rules and regulation. So if anyone is caught destroying the forest or taking anything timbers from the forest, they punish them. And they punish them through finance, or either the punishment by making them write bonds and things that, I'll never come to this forest, or I'll never do wrong things in this forest. So all this, they have their own way of taking care of it. So in the end, if we see over the period of time, the forest which was devastated is now has a huge good forest cover, also has a huge number of animals, varieties of animals. The peacocks come and sit in the houses of the community members also, and they have a good drinking water, and there is no longer sand deposit issue. So all of this, if we see that how there was challenge and how the community members came together and have rejuvenated that forest area. So these are some examples I just gave in the span of time. I would just move on to the other impacts, and would like to sum up my sharing is like, now the crucial part which comes on to the indigenous people is, one thing is very important to understand, that climate action cannot happen, or it's difficult to attain Paris Agreement goals, also climate action, if indigenous people are not an integral part of it. Now the thing is, why indigenous people needs to be an integral part of it? Because I'll just give a small example of free, prior, and informed consent. So when I had gone to my field areas, so when I had asked indigenous people, when I had gone to meet the indigenous leader, so he said that a lot of people had come to our village for plantation drives. And I was like, okay, for plantation drives. And then he was like, but we resisted because we do not want those plants to be planted in our area. So I was like, okay, but what were those plants which the community members, which the people wanted to plant in our areas? So then they said that they had brought fruit trees. They had brought jackfruit trees, They had brought mango trees to plant in our area. So I, being indigenous, still I was like, what's the problem if, it's mango tree or it's jackfruit tree? And then the community member said, it's a huge problem for us. So I was like, why? And then he said that if mango trees and jackfruit trees are planted in the periphery of our village, then wild boars will come, elephants will come, monkeys will come to eat those fruit trees, and they will destroy our agriculture crops. And that's why we don't want these trees to be planted, because this will lead to human and animal conflict, which took me aback. It took me aback because I, being from the indigenous community, still I did not have this perspective, because this perspective is very unique to their area or their region, which again they said that it is very important for us indigenous people to have sal trees in our areas, because that is good for our soil also, and that is good for our forest based livelihood. So we want sal trees and we don't want fruit trees. And that is when I realized that how important it is free, prior and informed consent. Just this is just a small example, which also shows that if these indigenous communities are not consulted in the process of implementation, then how it will lead to blunder, and again it will lead to victimization of indigenous people, that there is indigenous people are killing the animals, indigenous people are doing this, and there's a human animal and human conflict. The reason here is like the policies which looks good in the table, when it is implemented in the ground without taking into consideration of the indigenous people, leads to massive destructive impacts. So this is one of the example which I wanted to give. So another example which I wanted to give the context of how developmental projects affect the indigenous people and how it is very crucial in terms of climate action is that we all have been talking about impacts of air pollution in the cities, but people usually do not emphasize on the air pollution which happens in the rural areas. So if we see the air pollution which happens in the rural areas, and as I have been seeing and witnessing, most of the air pollution which happens in the rural areas is because of the extractive developmental projects. So now the thing is, if I give you an example that an indigenous communities who was living peacefully with these eco-friendly practices, and the eco-friendly practices which I said, and all of a sudden there was a there was imposition of developmental projects, and their lands were taken away from them. Now the thing is, when the lands are taken away, first thing which they say that we'll give you compensation. The compensation is either in terms of money, or the compensation is either in terms of giving you the job. So the first thing which is in terms of the money compensation, there has been numerous reports. It's very, very rare, and there has been absolutely no implementation of the remuneration or compensation of the indigenous people. It's been more than 50 to 60 years in our area, in a lot of area which our community members have been there. There has been no compensation. Now, if we talk about the compensation which is happening in the factories as jobs. So now the thing is, if we see in this developmental industries or factories, the indigenous communities members are given jobs at low levels. They are not given jobs at the high levels. The high level jobs are always given to the people, those who come from outside, and the low level jobs, the laborers or the workers or the low level jobs are given to the indigenous people, and they are at the risk of health crisis, and they are the ones who are affected by either tuberculosis or bronchitis, breathing problem. This also leads to that how the men, the death rate of the men in that area is very high, which also leads to early widow age of the women there, and which is again affecting their entire livelihood and their entire socio-economic status. And apart from that, the areas which are directly near the periphery of the industries are massively polluted, both in terms of air, both in terms of deposits of coal, or in terms of the water discharge also. as I had earlier said, that forest-based livelihood is a major source of the livelihood. But in this entire scenario, the forest-based livelihood absolutely destroyed because of the air pollution, because of the water discharge, the trees, the forest, which of the air of the forest-based livelihood, the entire produce decreases. And the amount which they were supposed to get or they used to get from the forest-based livelihood is so decreased that they are again forced to adopt other way of livelihood, which is again very difficult for them, and which is again comes with a lot of cost burden on them, because the forest based livelihood is also the major source of income through which they invest in their agriculture practices, and specifically in terms of the education of the children. So how, because of the extractive developmental projects, their sustainable forest based livelihood is also destroyed. And then if we come on to the women's safety also and women healthcare, specifically if we talk about pregnancy time, because in order to take the women to the hospital also, it is very difficult because all the roads are very spoiled. The roads are very spoiled and destroyed because of heavy bulk vehicles coming to the extractive developmental projects. And also if we see that most of the people do not have covered vehicles. When I say covered vehicles, it is like car or four-wheeler. They have managed to get, cycles or motorbikes, which is again very much exposure to air and dust. So even when the baby is small, or even when the woman is in the pregnancy time, so then again it leads to a lot of health challenges. So these are certain there. And also another thing which I wanted to highlight, that when there was no extractive developmental project, women were very freely able to access those areas. But because there has been extractive developmental project, there has been a lot of shop, there have lots of outsider coming into place, the women are not able to access those space. So the space of accessing, freely going out, reaching out to people is also curtailed. So this again entire scenario not only affects their health, their livelihood, but entire the socio-economic patterns and status. And also apart from that, one of the very important thing is, again, a lot of time there has been instances that this extractive developmental projects has also led to displacement and migration. Or even if their current establishment in the area without displacement and migration leads to inferiorization of the indigenous communities, their identity and their culture, because you are constantly made to feel that you are savage, you are backward, and this is the way of life which is too good. These are the food you should be eating, these are the clothes you should be wearing. So the inferiorization is so penetrated deep within and so implicit that it is very difficult for the indigenous communities and youth also. And this leads to loss of traditional knowledge, loss of languages, which if I see from a very outsider perspective, or very overview perspective, which also says that this is why because we have suffered a lot through this developmental projects, we say that we do not want this development projects, because all the promises which are made when this developmental projects happen has never been fulfilled. And that is why we want that we are able to practice our own way of living. And that is why we say that if we want indigenous people to contribute towards climate action, it is very important they be the way they have been. And that is why we cannot say that we need indigenous people's contribution. It is important to take indigenous people as an integral part of climate action. And we do not address this polluting industries or extractive developmental projects. Because if you do not address that, and if you do not hold that accountable, then indigenous communities will not be able to contribute because of the situational and because of the socio-political economy, how it influences or how it affects. So what I aim to say is that if we are talking about indigenous people's participation in climate action, it's very important to understand in a very holistic perspective. And it is very important to see that what are the situational factors which are leading to, and for which extractive developmental projects is very, very crucial, which needs to be addressed. Now coming on to the next thing which I would like to say, that it's very important to ensure that the rights of the indigenous people are recognized. This is my last point, and I'll be summing up. Now it's like I have heard a lot, like, why you just keep going on all around and saying rights, 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 rights of the indigenous people. I just want to make it very clear, or would like to share, that how rights of the indigenous people is very, very important. Because if a person is not safe, how will the person perform, or how will the person continue to contribute? Like, for example, if I take the example of myself, like, if I am living in a threat of being removed from my house tomorrow, so my all the focus, or my all the worries will be like, how do I protect myself that I'm not evicted from my place tomorrow? How I arrange food for myself tomorrow? I will not be able to emphasize on, to continue with my forest protection practices, because I will be in a fear the moment I go to forest to protect the forest. I come back home and I see my home is demolished. So this is a constant fear how indigenous people have been there and have been living through, and that is why I feel it's very important, as I said earlier also, that how it is intrinsic with the land and forest. And if you remove them from the land and forest, then there's a complete cultural, economic, social, political, up and down. And once that is there, they will not be able to contribute, and it also leads to loss of those knowledges. And that is why we say that indigenous people have been doing this since years, and that's why it is very important to emphasize that the rights are recognized, because that's one of the way also to ensure that we are giving justice to them and ensuring that their house and land is not taken away. And that's why I feel that until and unless an community is secure or feeling safe, they will not be able to contribute towards climate action. And that is why I feel rights recognition is very important. And another perspective to right recognition is also this, that who is living in the forest? Now the question is, because most of the people feel that forest is just trees and animals. It's not that. Indigenous people are also living in the forest along with the animals and along with the trees, and other organisms, in a very sustainable way. So I think it has been their colonial approach of conservation, which says that, it's important to remove indigenous people from the forest in order to protect the forest, which is completely wrong. Because if you remove the indigenous people from the forest, it's not only you're affecting indigenous people, but also you're affecting the forest itself, because indigenous people have been protecting them from the outsiders also. So it is very important to ensure and understand the perspective of how indigenous people and forest are intrinsically linked, and how it is very important that when we talk about conservation, it has to be rights recognition of indigenous people, and it has to be in a way that both the forest and the indigenous people are together. And that is also, if we see, there has been numerous report. If I take the IPCC report of UN on climate change, if I take the recent report of UN decade of ecosystem restoration, it all recognizes that how rights recognition of indigenous people is important for climate action, and also the traditional knowledge and practices. So also there has been numerous report which says that the areas where the rights recognized, where the rights of the indigenous people are recognized, they have been protecting it immensely. Also the thing is, because there is rights recognition happening, the carbon is also stocked in the forest, because the moment the right recognition does not happen, there is issues of land alienation, land grabbing, and displacement and migration. So it's also a multiple dimension when we talk about the rights recognition thing. And when I end towards the end, I would just like to say that, indigenous people are the leaders of conservation and climate action. It's very important to ensure that they should not be victims of climate action, and they should not be victims of climate crisis and biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Archana, for such a powerhouse presentation. Let me just turn off the recording.